Hello and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the Asia Center at the University of Utah. The Asia Center is a Title VI National Resource Center for Asian and Pacific Studies. The center serves as a hub for Asia-related activities at the University of Utah involving teaching, research, events, and outreach to K-12 schools and the broader community. The Asia Center supports Asian studies in its broadest sense, incorporating the languages and countries of the core regions of East, South, Southeast, and Central Asia, as well as Russia, the Pacific, and West Asia. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is Beyond the Bloc, Asian American Voting and Political Power. Our moderator for today's forum will be Rosie Nguyen, anchor at ABC4 News. If you have questions for our panelists, please enter them into the YouTube chat. And with that, I will turn the time over to our moderator.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for that great introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. It's my pleasure to be here and assist with moderating this forum. As you guys all know, this is the time of an era of technology. So if there's any technical glitches, such as me trying to find out how to unmute my microphone, thank you for everybody's patience. I just want to let you know that today we do have 4 scheduled panelists. We have 2 so far that's hopped onto the call, and we're waiting for 2 more. We know this is a busy season. There's Representative Karen Kwan jumping onto the call right now. Representative Kwan, welcome to the panel.
Hi, I'm so sorry I'm late. We just got off of floor time.
It's okay. We know it's like prime. The session's kicked off, and we knew, we're like, hey, Karen Kwan is going to jump in a little bit late, but that's okay. We were just introducing our panel guests, actually. So you actually just hopped on at the right time. I will start with introducing our panel. We have Dr. or Professor Baodong Liu. He's with the Political Science Department at the University of Utah. We also have Shu Chang, who is the director at the Asian Association of Utah. And of course, we have Representative Karen Kwan with the Utah State Legislature. And the last guest that we are waiting on is Councilmember Tom Nguyen of West Valley City. But of course, whenever he can hop on and join us on the call, then we'll just slide him right into the conversation. So we're going to kick off our panel with starting with getting to know our panelists a little bit. The question is, what is your connection to the topic that we're discussing in the panel today? How does it connect to the scope of your work? And how do you approach this topic from your professional or personal background? So Dr. Liu, let's start with you.
Thank you, Rosie. This is Dr. Baodong Liu. I'm a professor of political science and ethnic studies here at U. The reason I'm here is because professionally, I'm a political scientist and election is my specialty. So 2020 election, as you know, is very important for our nation. But more specifically, I'm also a scholar of Asian American experience. So I teach classes for ethnic studies program here at the U as well. And so Asian Americans and politics, that's where I focus on professionally.
Drew, let's go ahead and switch it over to you. How does today's topic connect to your scope of work, and how do you approach this topic from a professional and personal background?
I have been with the Asian Association of Utah for quite a few years, and our agency really started with providing services for refugees coming from Southeast Asia. And so as we are expanding services, we cover refugees from all parts of the world. And so we do have a lot of experience working with immigrants and refugees. In terms of political participation, since most of the immigrants, if they become citizens, they will become eligible voters. And so it is very important that in our delivering the services and also in our ESL class is to try to get individuals to be more learning more about citizenship and civic engagement. And so that's really the part that we're talking about today.
All right, and let's continue on with Representative Kwan. Representative, how does today's topic connect to your scope of work? We know that you're up on Capitol Hill as a member of the House of Representatives. How do you approach this topic from your professional and personal background?
So professionally, so outside of the legislature, I teach psychology at Salt Lake Community College. And actually, my very first job here in Utah was at Asian Association of Utah. Dr. Chang was my mentor since I came to Utah. It has taught me so much about Utah Asian American communities and politics. And I follow his lead quite a bit. So my work really it's integrated with my professional life as a professor, in my advocacy work with Asian and Pacific Islander communities, and then in my public service here at the legislature. You know, I'm the very first Chinese American to serve at the state level in the legislature, and I find that holds a lot of honor, but also responsibility. And so I am very mindful of being understanding of the issues within our communities.
This next question, I'd like to start with a local approach, and then we'll go national. So let's go back to Dr. Chang to this question. What are some of the variations that we see in Asian American voting and political behavior? What influences this? I think in the past, you know, as with every single demographic that we saw in the past 2020 presidential election cycle, we saw a variation, and people think, you know, when it comes to a certain maybe ethnic or minority group, that we all tend to kind of swing the same way or vote the same way. And that's not really the case. So Dr. Chang, what do you think are some of the variations that we see when we study the outcome of Asian Americans voting in the election?
Asian Americans basically are a very wide spectrum of ethnic community groups. And because of the different geographic areas that they came from, and as well as, you know, the background, you know, if they come as refugees, they have a certain economic backgrounds. And if they come as immigrants, you know, that would be another layers of voters. The other part is that there are also a lot of scholars, professionals who came to this country and become very successful economically as well as socially. So it is a very wide variety of community groups. So within the last 20 years, because the number of Asian Americans had increased so rapidly, the number become very, very noticeable. And especially when people look at the Georgia election, and they realize that even though they comprise of only about 3 or 4% of the population, and somehow it become a critical determining factor in the election. Not that, you know, the total number is very large, but because of the way that they vote. Now, most likely is that the individual who involved with the business is gonna want more interest related to business, how to, you know, get their business going, how taxation issue is gonna affect them, you know. But I think also somehow is tied to background. You know, so there are some groups that are more tied to a certain you know, political parties and stuff. So, but I think in general, Asian American voters are very diverse, and they cover all spectrums of the party's affiliations as well.
Representative Kwan, I'm curious to see your take on this because you're an elected official. So I'm wondering, like, you know, when you've campaigned multiple times and you're trying to appeal to our Asian American community, like, what have you observed as far as the variations that we see in voting patterns and behavior?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for the question. I will focus in on my comments here in Utah, but I do want to comment on nationwide trends as well. Now, Asian American and Pacific Islanders are the fastest growing racial group in the nation, and we know that it is also we also see that here in Utah. In aggregate, we have about 75,000 voters, eligible AAPI voters here in the state of Utah, but we certainly don't see the kinds of voting at that level. We have, as Dr. Chang talked about, a very diverse group of Asian and Pacific Islanders here in Utah. And we see that their political affiliation is consistent with national trends. One of the questions is whether or not we vote as a bloc, and we don't vote as a bloc. In fact, our Asian American community members are probably the most untapped ethnic community politically in the state and certainly in the nation. And so we see some of the political challenges, the voting challenges, again, here in Utah as well as nationwide, of poor voter outreach and contact, lack of language access, translation services, and other socioeconomic challenges to our voters.
I think those are great points to make. As with anybody, I think this past election cycle, we've heard a lot of people say that families' Thanksgiving dinners were sort of divisive because one side was voting for the other. I have family members that voted one way and disagreed with the other way as well. And one thing that I thought was very interesting that you mentioned is language barriers. I have family members who don't speak or read or write English very well. So they tune into certain channels that will translate maybe the news of the day in Vietnamese. But if they're not aware that those channels may be slanting the news a certain way, then they're only ingesting information a certain way, and that could influence their political leanings as well. So since you did touch on the national aspect, let's transition over to Professor Liu, who has that national, historical, and comparative background. Dr. Liu, what's your take on this? Oh, your microphone's muted, by the way. You'll have to unmute your microphone. There you go.
Apologize for the difficulty. Like my fellow panelists already mentioned, the diversity and complexity of our community invites very, very deep understanding of the history and the comparative perspectives of this community. And we have, you know, roughly give and take 20 million people in the US as we speak now. So if you want to understand this such a big and growing, rapidly growing community, you have to appreciate the complexity and diversity. Now, if you want to start to think about Asian American community, historically, you can start with way back to the 1800s, to even before the formation of our republic. The very first Filipino immigrant came to this continent as far back as 1775, or around that, in St. Bernard Parish around the Louisiana area. But over time, there has been waves of migrations from Asia to this country. And you know that Asia is a big, a massive land with more than 20 countries that we speak today. to represent the origins of the Asian American community. So all of them represent very rich history and deep social and cultural backgrounds that a lot of us in this country do not know a lot about yet. And among the voters that Dr. Chen mentioned, 2/3 of the current voters are actually naturalized citizens. So they have experience as immigrants. And if you want to understand them, you have to go back to their origin to understand how they culturally digest the political information. And that's a lot of work for anybody to start with. Of course, for Representative Kwan, who represents this massive community, it's a high order for any politician to know all these different, very diverse people. But even for the immigrants, there has been a variety of stories that we have to understand. For example, for the largest ethnic group, the Chinese, we're talking about 5 million of them. And the very early immigrant from mainland China, from the Guangdong area, they came here in the 1840s. And that was way before a lot of Europeans that started to migrate to America. And so they became a part of the very early labor in the Western expansion. And their relationship with other racial minority and white majority became a history of this nation. It's American story. And we all know that their relations early on in the history were not all pleasant because there was widespread racial discrimination against Chinese. And in that discrimination led to eventually the passage of the nation's 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So you have to understand that early part of history to understand the 1/3 of the community that has the origin way far way back in the 1800s. And then you're talking about more recent arrivals. And we're talking about people from all kinds of walks of life, not only Chinese, but Koreans, Japanese, Vietnamese, Filipinos, and Malaysian, and South Asians, Indians, Pakistanians, and so on and so forth. All of them represent different cultures, different histories, and they came here with different reasons. Some of them came here because they chose to come here. Others came here because of political reasons, as refugees. For example, the fall of Saigon in Vietnam put a lot of people in jeopardy in Southeastern Asian countries, and they had to move out of their own country, and they came here. And other, more recent immigrants came here even later than Vietnamese. We're talking about, for example, Hmongs, and they are the refugees, and they came here in late 70s, early 80s, and even following that. But there's also a big wave of the immigrants from India and China, as as Professor Chen mentioned, those people who came here first as students and then decided to stay in this country, and they then brought their family here. So we're talking about a variety of backgrounds that most Americans are not very familiar with.
I'd like to say that every single human being, we're pretty much made up of kind of a recipe. You have to think about, right, our culture, our age, our religion, our upbringing, our environment, and all of those factors, right, influence us as an individual and the beliefs and the political behaviors and values that we have. Next question will be for Dr. Chang. Knowing what we know now with the way the discussion is going, how do we now better measure, discuss, or understand the Asian American political thought?
I think it's very important to realize that the Asian Americans, they have needs and they have desire and they have ambition, just like any other citizens. And so their voting is going to be responding to how legislation and national policy is going to affect them, as well as their family and their community. When I read something about the Georgia election, it was very interesting that one of the Pakistani voter being interviewed are saying that I cast this vote because of my religion, because my religion has been excluded from being able to come to this country. And so I want to change that. So be it related to political affiliation, but that also affects fundamentally the person's human basic needs and rights. And so I think the voting behavior within the Asian American is going to be responding to national needs. Yesterday, we heard our President Biden talking about how to address xenophobia and also racism issue because of the pandemic. And so those are very good issues. In fact, the pandemic has been proportionally heavily affecting the Asian American population because of the kind of small business sector that they are in. Many of the Asian Americans are involving in business that require people coming to patronize in their small business, like restaurants and other kinds of business. And that has been very much affected. In fact, one of the statistics I read about the New York City Chinatown, almost 75% of the restaurants has been heavily hit. And so economically, they are really suffering. So whether or not there will be national programs that help them to rebuild the businesses are going to be critical for them. So I think they will become more active in supporting ideas that would help their community, help their own small businesses in this critical juncture of the pandemic.
Professor Liu, what do you think? How do we better measure, discuss, and understand Asian American political thought?
To just use a quick example, before the pandemic, when I taught class, such as Asian American experience course, I first give them the very first assignment to write their family story. So all the kids in my class need to write an essay with a pretty good understanding of their own origin. And we're talking about Utah, so most of my students are white LDS students. So they started to think about how their family came to this country. And then I asked all the students to have a quick presentation of their own story. And then finally, at the end of the semester, I asked all the students to have what I call the exit interview, which I asked all of them to interview at least one Asian Pacific Islander Americans, at least one, and use what we learned in the class to try to explain how the interviewees told them their story compared to the very first assignment in which they talked about their own story. And I think that is a good way for Utahns to know the complexity of Asian Americans, and also to understand everybody brings a story to this country. Finally, it's American story. It's a quintessential American story. The Asian American story, I just mentioned the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Professor Chen just mentioned the executive order of President Biden yesterday to help the country to fight discrimination against Asian Americans. Because of this pandemic, a lot of Americans start to be consumed by hatred and misunderstanding about Asians. They, for example, attack all Asians and say, go back to China, even though a lot of them have nothing to do with China. So, but if you look at the American story, yesterday, President Biden issued a new executive order. But not too long ago, remember, the Japanese Americans were put in the internment camp by an executive order of one of the greatest presidents of our country, the Executive Order 9066 in 1942, that put Japanese American in internment camp. But today, we have this new administration that is trying to fight against racial discrimination. So this is what I always say to my students. History indeed repeats itself, but history does not always produce the same result. So if you look at the Asian American story, you have to understand that in order to see why there is, for example, hate crimes against Asian Americans, you need to understand the American psychological story, the story centered around the 1790 Naturalization Act, which says only free white persons can be citizens of this country, right? That's in 1790. But since evolved over time, we had Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese Internment Act, executive order, but now we have the new executive order to try to fight against the discrimination. These are all American stories. So the way to really fully embrace America itself is to acknowledge the historical facts first, and then you can move on. You can make progress.
Representative Kwan, let's get your take in here. How do you think that we can better measure, discuss, and understand Asian American political thought?
Thank you, Rosie. You know, I said earlier that we don't vote as a bloc. Although in different presidential elections, we have voted more for one party or another, and it seems to change. We're seeing Asian Pacific Islanders who voted primarily, that's probably not the right word, at 53% for the Democratic Party, or people in the Democratic Party this year, in 2020, I should say last year. But we do see differences within ethnic groups and regional differences, but we often see immigration patterns follow regional areas. We saw, actually, you mentioned your family, Vietnamese Americans were the group that voted the most conservatively in this, and they tend to have voted the most conservatively. But when we're talking about policies and issues, specific issues, there are specific issues that we tend to vote in a bloc. Dr. Liu and Dr. Chang both mentioned immigration. That's one where we are, we tend to support immigration laws that are bring families together, right? Family unification and pathways to citizenship. We tend to support policies that enhance and improve and protect the environment. Policies on stricter gun laws and policies that enhance and protect education. So these are the areas that if we are looking to engage our voting communities, those are the policies that we should be looking at. And we do in the Democratic Party. I just want to put that plug in there. Those are very consistent with my party. It's about outreach. It's about translating information in ways that make sense to our communities. It's about understanding our communities. Our communities don't have an automatic trust for government. Perhaps because of how and why they immigrated, but even so, after generations of being Asian American, there's concerns about racism and systemic racism in America. So trust is a very important issue for both parties, or all parties, I should say. To overcome those trust issues, the easy way to do that is to elect more people from within the communities that already have those trusted relationships with our community members. We have currently 251 Asian and Pacific Islander state legislators across the nation. 2 are here in Utah, Senator Iwamoto and I. There was 3 2 years ago, and 1 had retired. But it's interesting that 2 years ago, I was talking to a colleague in New York, and I said, "Oh, we only have 3." At that time, we had 3 Asian American legislators, and she said, from New York, she said, "You have more than New York State." And I was very surprised. Today, there are 4 in New York state legislators. And we heard Dr. Chang talk about the Georgia election, and there were so many news stories that talked about how Asian Pacific Islander communities helped to change the elections there. I shouldn't say change as in but it changed the makeup of the political parties in power in Georgia. There are 3 Asian Americans in Georgia. I seem to remember that there are more, so my stats may be a little bit off, but there are states that we might not even consider or know that we have many state legislators that are Asian American, or Asian or Pacific American. Minnesota actually has the #1 makeup of Hmong state legislators, and they have 5 currently. So, when we think about state legislators and political parties, we often think about the coast. We need to start looking at how we are changing within the nation as well. We need to reach out in familial and cultural ways, and translate the political spectrum, the political engagement in a way that makes sense for us. Let me give you an example. This is not about voting, but I believe, and Dr. Liu can help me with this, Wong Kim Ark in 1898 was the very first person in American history to take a civil rights case and win to the United States Supreme Court. That's civic engagement. This is the kind of stuff that we have seen. I shouldn't say stuff. These are the kind of engagement, civic engagement that we have seen within our communities. Once I decided to run, it was the community. I wouldn't be here, without, sorry, I'm getting a little weepy, getting a little emotional here. Because it's not about the faceless mass that's out there. With our communities, it's family. With our communities, it's friends. It's people we've known for 30 years. It's mentors. It's people who come to support us and believe in us because we are consistently a part of and support of within the communities. And that's what our political parties, all of our political parties, need to understand. Thank you.
I know this is a cause very personal to all of us, and it's great to see you share that personal value to you. I'd like to loop in an audience question that we got that I think ties in to what we've been talking about. I'm going to direct it first to Dr. Chang. Since Asian American voters have less clear partisan trends, what are some strategies both parties are trying to use to increase their Asian American support?
I think our country is in a crossroad of transition. We talk about the balance of power between different countries. And international politics play a very large role in our American politics. And currently, the confrontation between the United States and China will affect how the general public view about Asian Americans. Unfortunately, that has been generalized to all Asian Americans. Obviously, we are all very concerned about how our country will be able to be prosperous and to be economically viable. However, viewing China as more and more of an adversary is going to be very difficult for especially the Chinese American to be able to look at how to. I know that even back in when Hiram Fong from Hawaii, during the 60s and 70s, tried to navigate the conflicts or political differences between the United States and China. He took a very strong role against the Communist Party of China. But the politics is mixed with also economic policies, because you also have trade policies, you also have international trades that affects business here as well. So it's a very, very complicated situation. But I can see that politically, that has been used as almost like an ammunition to say, well, how tough could you be against China? Or you are too weak, you are part of the, but anyway, those type of manipulation is going to be very difficult. And I think for Asian American, what I really am very happy nowadays is that I see a lot of different Asian American groups come forward, from the Indian population, from the Korean population, and the Vietnamese populations. And so this diversity is going to help to kind of water down some of those confrontations. And but I do think that one of the things that for Asian American to realize is that we also have a lot of common issues with, let's say, like the Black Lives Matter movement. It was interesting to see how many Asian American Republicans are saying that they are in support of the Black Lives Matter, even though it may not be a popular stance within the party, because they experience themselves of, even though they have been at the pinnacle of success, the kind of discrimination that they face. It may not be just that a big matter. It could be just going to a restaurant and not being served, or being called names, or the children being bullied at school, or something like that. So the Asian American concerns are also ties to this civil rights movement within the United States. And so I think what we need to realize is that we should be looking for movement that benefits of strengthening the families and also encouraging children to do well and small business to be successful. I think it would be very important to maintain a balance within the population. And so I obviously think that there's a lot to do still, but progress in the civil rights and civil society, civic participation moves very slowly. And so for a lot of time we say, well, this whole issue comes back over and over again. And but I think that we need to stay optimistic that socially, the Asian American is still a very significant part of our society.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. We are coming up on the end of our time for the discussion, and then we'll move to audience questions. I'm going to direct this last question to Representative Kwan, and then we'll move to the audience questions. Representative Kwan, what is the significance of having the first person of Asian descent in the White House?
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It is very important to have representation so that my 14-year-old can look to her and say, my mixed race 14-year-old can look to her and say, yes, I can do this. Her Vice President Harris's immigrant story is so central to our story as Asian Pacific Islanders. It resonates not only in our own lives, but it sort of feels like there's this, sort of feeling like, oh, there's hope and people are going to be listening and policies will address the inequities that we saw during the pandemic, that there is an understanding of systemic racism and how that impacts us. There's an understanding that we are a diverse group. There is an understanding that we lack representation, even though we have numbers. So it is a great a thing that we have this. I was so honored and like flabbergasted when I met her. I mean, I was such a fangirl, I gotta tell you, and I still am. I have so much hope, and especially for our young daughters and granddaughters and grandsons and sons and people who can look up to her as a role model and say, yes, I can.
Thank you, Representative Kwan. Let's move now to the audience questions. We've got a few good ones. I'm going to direct this next question to Professor Liu. I'm going to kind of combine two of them just for the sake of time. Can you talk about whether Asian American political participation and voting patterns were shaped by the discourse from the past presidential administration that was at times anti-Asian, in particular anti-Chinese, which fueled xenophobia in our country? And how lasting will the shock of the xenophobia of the previous administration be?
That's a great question. And to answer this question, again, it is probably imperative to look at the history a little bit, because the long history of Chinese in America, there has been different kinds of historical episodes where presidents used different historical events to campaign for their own political benefits. And perfect example would be, back in the Red Scare era, right? The communist China, and all the way to current era, how China as a rising power become a political issue that Dr. Chan already addressed a little bit earlier, the overall pattern we can see from this very recent 2020 election is that the Asian communities themselves are evolving. And one can argue that President Trump launched his 2016 campaign based on an agenda that put a lot of racial minorities and religious minorities in some political uncertainty, to say the least. And so white nationalism has grown over time. So the expectation from scholarly world is that this 2020 election will become a referendum on Trump's agenda. And there should be more support from the white community for Trump and less support from the minority community. But if you look at the 2020 election, outcome, you can see that the Asian communities themselves are evolving. And we mentioned, for example, the Vietnamese community as a very conservative community. But to make a conclusion just because there has been more than 50% support for Trump from the Vietnamese community, according to some surveys, not ex post, because Vietnamese are so small as a community, usually national ex post don't include them in their questions. But in some surveys that touched upon ethnic groups, Vietnamese are indeed discovered as more conservative, to be more likely to support President Trump. And there are many speculations as for why they have been supportive of President Trump. One is the conservatism itself, based on family value, based on how individuals want to be successful in their own business and so on and so forth. But another crucial factor that many people tend to ignore is the fact that their immigrant history itself play a huge role. Remember earlier we talked about the fall of Saigon, and Vietnamese community had a vivid memory of how communist regime produced a tragedy in their own nation. And the Trump administration was able to keep sending message that the Democratic Party is too left. There's a radical left, they are the communists. And there are a lot of language, even in their ethnic language, like Vietnamese or Chinese and Koreans, depicting the Democratic Party as the communists. And that indeed has pushed some of the Asian communities, especially immigrant communities, to be more conservative, to be more supportive of President Trump. However, and there are also the history of civil rights movement, like the Dr. Chen said, the traditional party balance is in favor of the Democratic Party, because in the civil rights movement, thanks to Martin Luther King's legacy, the multiracial coalition that included Asian Americans from 1960 on all the way to now still produce more political dividend for the Democratic Party. And that is reflected by our Congress. Right now, Congress has 18 Asian American representatives and senators. 16 of them are Democrats, but 2 new Republican are Korean Americans from California, the stronghold of Democratic Party. So that story itself says a lot about two-party strategies to try to use the leverage they have to gain more political power in the Asian community by mobilizing Asian community to help them win crucial races. And that is something all of us need to pay more attention to. And that's also back to Representative Kwan's call for action. It is the time for Asians to get involved in politics. Asians have to be elected and represent Asians. And that is what we call political incorporation. Political incorporation has a huge consequence on Asian Americans' political psychology. It will boost their psychology to be more confident, to show leadership, and that calls for more Tom Bradley-like Asian Americans, mayors, for example, that are Asian Americans governing large cities like LA, Atlanta, New York. Andrew Yang is running for mayor's office. And all of those things will help political incorporation. And that is crucial for Asian Americans to evolve their own political identity to find the real political home, either Democratic Party or Republican Party. It's an exciting time, to say the least.
May I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Ching.
One thing I think is very important to address the issue about Vice President Kamala Harris. And I think this phenomenon is really great, not just because of her being, from very different backgrounds, but also being a woman to be able to take on that role. And I think that the one thing that we all really have to remember is that when we talk about the political party affiliation, we have to understand that both parties has been making a lot of contribution to all American. And we have to really not only focus on the differences, but focus on how both parties should be able to work for people in general, and that they are also capable of doing that for helping all American citizens. And I think that right now we have a lot of division is because maybe we fail to acknowledge that we have a lot of more in common, that we can together make a great joint adventure for generations to come. And rather than focusing necessarily only on the differences and not being able to acknowledge the contribution from both parties that are working for all the citizens in the United States. And so I think as far as the Asian American, I think most of the families are very much into how to help themselves and their family members to be successful, their community to be engaging and to be supportive of each other. It really have very little to do with the international politics, from what I can see.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. All right, we probably have time for one more audience question. I'd like to direct the last question to Representative Kwan. I kind of want to tie this to an audience question and a question that we initially had planned out. So the question is, what are the current trends regarding Asian Americans running for office in Utah nationally? Are there any initiatives aimed at increasing that number, as well as what impact could this growth, right, and the Asian American voting power have on our elections and government in the future?
Yes, thank you, Rosie. So I talked a little bit about the trends already nationally, and in Utah we have now. I'm just sort of going off of my own count. 7 elected officials. There may be more that I have missed. 7 elected officials that I know of who are Asian and Pacific Islander. It's not representative of our community, and so to be representative of our community, that is a certainly a laudable goal to get to. I do know that there are organizations here in Utah specifically looking at how we can recruit and help Asian Pacific Islander candidates to be successful in their candidacy. That's APAPA Utah, Asian Pacific American Political Action. Oh, somebody's going to call me and say that is not it, but it's APAPA Utah. It's a national organization, and we have a chapter here that's again that looks into this. I do want to touch upon what Dr. Chang said, that our communities, you know, by and large, in my experience, our communities don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. They don't. And I rarely have people within my community ask me if I'm a Democrat or a Republican. I mean, it happens, but and we of course have people who are very engaged in the political process, and that is a very important question to them. But by and large, our communities are looking at those issues. They're looking at the policies that do improve their lives, that does people that listen, people that seem to understand the family issues as well as the business issues. We've had such a show of such inequality with the pandemic. Our communities have been hit at a higher level with COVID-19. Our communities have had more violence and hate crimes against them. We've seen more bullying. We've seen, as you were talking about the previous administration, we've seen more name calling, and this affects our community members. It affects our friends, our family, and our children. And so when we look at the trends to increase the number of Asian Pacific Islanders, we need to be mindful, again, of the trust issues within our communities that neither political party, or maybe I should say all political parties, need to be sincere, genuine, authentic in attempting to gain an understanding of the issues within our communities.
Thank you, Representative Kwan. What an insightful conversation. The time just flew by. There's a lot of audience questions that we didn't get a chance to address and bring up in this panel, and I'm sorry for that. You guys are all welcome to reach out to us individually if you are so interested in getting your questions answered with the panelists. Again, I just wanted to thank you everybody for setting this up. Thank you to our panelists. We had Dr. Shu Chang, Director at the Asian Association of Utah. We had Representative Karen Kwan with the Utah State Legislature, and of course, Professor Baodong Liu with the Political Science Department at the University of Utah. Thank you to the Asia Center at the University of Utah, as well as the Hinckley Institute for setting this all up. My name is Rosie Nguyen with ABC4 News. It was a pleasure to moderate this panel tonight. I would like to toss it back to our student forum host, Ann Lopez, to close the panel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosie. Just on behalf of the Hinckley Institute, I just want to thank all the panelists again and our moderator, Rosie. It was a wonderful, wonderful forum, and we appreciate all of your expertise and passion and insight that you brought to this subject. And to our audience, we just want to say thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next forum.
Okay.